Okay, Christina, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us in this side event of the Global Education Summit, where we will analyze the relationship between debt servicing and investment in public services, especially education, and how it affects the right to education. So I will give the floor to our chair, Madeleine Zuniga, which is Vice President of the Global Campaign for Education Board. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Madeleine. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I would like to welcome one. Then thank you for joining us today in this event co-organized by the Global Campaign for Education, Action Aid, and Society Foundation. Our aim is to promote a deep reflection and an open debate on how debt and austerity policies are impacting education financing and consequently the access to inclusive and equitable quality education for all, as it is stated in SDG 4. Debt and austerity policies are impacting public spending and quality of public services, especially regarding the right to education. Countries that spend over 12% of national budgets on debt services public spending in recent years. In-debt countries often have to turn to the International Monetary Fund, whose policy advice tends to focus on fiscal consolidation, which is widely known as austerity. One of the flagship austerity policies is to hold down public spending, especially through cutting or freezing public sector wage bills. In most countries, teachers are the largest group of public workers, and these constraints are actively undermining the capacity of countries to increase teachers' salaries and or recruit more teachers, even when there are desperate shortages of them. In order to discuss what GPE and education advocates can do to engage in more strategic discussions at national and international levels around debt and austerity, we have gathered a wonderful group of panelists with extensive expertise on these issues, whom I would like to thank sincerely for joining us today. The order of the presentations will be the following. First of all, Rifat Sabat, GCE President, and GCE, the Arabic Coalition of Education for All President as well. He will be talking about debt cancellation for the Future of Education campaign. He will speak from Palestine. Isabel Ortiz, Social Justice Program Initiative for Policy Dialogue, joining us from New York. Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky, former United Nations independent expert on foreign debt and human rights. Lydie Nakbil, coordinator of Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Christopher Yalukanda, research director at Zambia National Union of Teachers, member of Education International. Monica Novillo, speaking from Bolivia, is a regional coordinator of the Network of Popular Education Among Women. Tato Kundadze is a researcher, and he will present the outcomes of a new research conducted by or financed by Open Society Foundation as GCE. The name of the research is Debt Relief and Education Financing in Georgia. And finally, Irina Kandadze is the executive director of the Center for Training and Consultancy, also from Georgia. Our most sincere gratitude to all of you. We will be having an initial intervention from the speakers, and they will have a question and answer session afterwards. Interpretation is available in English, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. Please select your preferred channel. I kindly request speakers to be mindful of the work of interpreters and speak slowly and distinctly. I will start by giving the floor to Rifat Saba, GCE president, and he will talk, as I said, about debt cancellation for the Future of Education campaign. Rifat is the general director and founder of the Teacher Creativity Center. The center is part of a number of international initiatives, including the Global Campaign for Education and Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Rifat is a regional coordinator of the Global Campaign for Education. He is also the chair of the Arab Network for Human Rights and Citizenship Education, and was elected to this position among 75 members. Rifat completed his master's degree in 2004 from Birzeit University in Palestine in women development and law. He completed a diploma degree in adult training development from Toronto University, Canada in 1998. He was elected president of the Global Campaign for Education in 2018, and he has recently been honored as PhD from Yemeni universities for his role to support education in Yemen. Dear Rifat, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Madeleine. Thank you everyone for joining today. I feel deeply honored to represent the Global Campaign for Education in this forum, as well as to open this crucial discussion with our high-level panel of experts. I think we are all aware of the historic crossroads we stand at today. We are facing a serious global education crisis, deepened by COVID-19 pandemic, which not only will have devastating effects on the achievement of the SDG4, but also threatens to reverse the significant education progress of the last decades. During the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, an estimated 1.5 billion learners had their education stopped or interrupted. This means that over 1 billion individuals have lost out on learning because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This means that there are more than 1 billion voices of affected people, students, teachers, parents, communities, who deserve a say on what has happened to them and what needs to happen now. That is the aim of the GCE 1 Billion Voices campaign, and that's why I am here. The good news is that we are in the right place to make these voices heard and start addressing the education crisis GBEs, the education crisis. GBE's Global Education Summit is putting education in the top of the global political agenda. And we expect donor countries to show their commitment to education at this meeting. However, both donor countries and multilateral institutions must also demonstrate their willingness to take the right to education seriously through other policies. And I am referring, obviously, to how they address debt issues and the subsequent austerity policies, which are an unbearable burden, especially for least developed and low-income countries. Debt and austerity policies are worsening the challenges around public financing and the ever-increasing pressure on resources for quality public service. which is resulting in less prioritization of education. Indebted countries often have to turn to the IMF, whose policy advice tends to focus on fiscal consolidation, widely known as austerity. One of the flagship austerity policies is to hold down public spending, especially through cutting or freezing public sector wage bills. In most countries, teachers are the largest group of public workers, and these constraints are actively undermining the capacity of countries to increase teacher salaries and or recruit more teachers, even where there are desperate shortages. So one thing leads to the others. Countries that spend over 12% of the national budgets on debt servicing have cut public spending in recent years. And the number of countries in this situation is rising rapidly, especially since COVID. And this is particularly affecting public educational systems, just when and where they are most needed. For example, the World Bank project potential 10% cut in education budget due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Time is short, but I would like to mention some of the policies that GCE recommends to address these issues. First of all, there is no doubt that states must increase and improve domestic financing for education. We must not forget that domestic resources remain the most important source for funding education, providing around 97% of the total educational funding. However, they need to be able to do so. The allocation of domestic financing resources to pay debt services rather than ensuring people's basic human rights, including, of course, the right to education, will significantly impact countries' development in the short and long term. So, first of all, urgent action must be taken on debts, including debt cancellation for the least developed and low development countries, debt alleviation for middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries, and debt swaps subject to sign agreement from countries and debt swaps subject to a signed agreement from countries to invest in education for middle and even high income countries with debt distress. Secondly, GCE also believe that multilateral and donor aid should avoid any form of indebtedness of low and middle income countries, many of whom are already in high or moderate debt distress, and doing so at a time of raising debt vulnerabilities, as documented both by civil society actors and the IMF. Loan mechanisms do not provide predictable and sustainable financing sources that help governments make the long-term investments that are needed to improve education. Thirdly, I would like to point out that austerity measures are not a way out of an economic crisis. So multilateral institutions should support investment rather than austerity. Social services, including education, should be the last areas to face cuts. Finally, let's not forget that this is all about people, real people with dreams, hopes, rights that are not being fulfilled. More than 1 billion people, children, youth, marginalized groups who are the most affected, and they trust us all, governments, world leaders, civil society, to take urgent action. We must not let them down. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Rifat. Just one thing I forgot to say at the beginning. Each speaker has only 5 minutes to present their intervention. Rifat spent a little bit more, but I would like all of you to be very much aware of the time you have. It's a precious time, and we are sorry that we can give you only that little time. Thank you, Rifat, again. I think your first intervention has set up the main concerns and the worries about debt and especially these austerity policies that are affecting deeply the right to education. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to Isabel Ortiz. Isabel, wait a minute, Isabel is from Spain, but he's speaking from New York because he is based in that country for several years. She is the director of the Global Social Justice Program at Joseph Stiglitz Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. Earlier, she was director at the International Labour Organization and UNICEF, among other positions. With her, we are taking a closer look to the so-called austerity policies, their impacts, and, most important thing for us, possible alternatives. Dear Isabel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. As Refat was saying, the situation is very worrisome. We have been analyzing the fiscal projections of the IMF over the years to understand what countries and what governments might be doing. And it is extremely worrisome because in the last World Economic Outlook of the IMF, it shows that includes projections done by IMF country economists. It shows that just now, as we are speaking, about 154 countries are expected to cut public expenditures. And next year, about 159 countries will be cutting public expenditures. So you get an idea. I'm going to show a map. So it shows the intensity and depth of the cuts. So this, the countries that are colored shows the countries that will be cutting public expenditure. So as you can see, virtually the whole world will be reducing public expenditures in terms of GDP. And of course, that is extremely worrisome because as it has been pointed, the typical fiscal consolidation or austerity measures include wage bill cuts on cuts. And it's important to get the language right because this may be the language that will be used. And that will include cutting the number or the salaries of teachers, which are the larger component of the wage bill in general in most countries. And as many studies show, in many developing countries, actually teachers already have very low salaries. So that will have a very negative impact on education. And other measures that we need to watch out are the elimination of subsidies, including food subsidies. And this is at a time where food prices are at maximum highs. And also social security reforms, including social safety nets rationalization. And this is important how the international financial institutions tend to work. In general, what they say is that they are improving the safety nets and the social protection system. In the reality, what they are doing is targeting and giving benefits, minimal benefits, only to the poorest at the very bottom. Now, what happens in most developing countries is that many people are vulnerable, not just the very, very poor, and many people need support. In particular, child benefits are fundamental for education because sometimes they are the difference between children going to school or being able to buy some books or shoes or or better food, which is essential. But not only child benefits are fundamental, the reality is that any benefit that goes to the household generally is invested in children. So that's why we need to really take care on all these social security reforms and safety nets improvements that include targeting only to the poorest. Reality is the agreement of the SDGs was to commit towards universal social protection in which everybody will have access to needed social protection. And other reforms are labor reforms and VAT increases and others. But what is important here to say is that this map that I'm showing that shows this tsunami of cuts coming, it does not need to happen. This is only will be like that if we don't do anything. However, there are things that we can do to stop it. And the most important one, it is to understand that there are alternatives to austerity. And financing of what has been called fiscal space options, they exist even in the poorest countries. There are at least 8 options, 8, which is a lot of options. These options are supported by policy statements of the United Nations and the international financial organizations. And governments around the world have been applying them for decades, showing that there is a wide variety of options. Okay, the first one, and I'm going to go very quickly. The first one will be to increase progressive tax revenues. That means to avoid tax revenues that are regressive, like VAT or consumption taxes, which are taxes that the poor pay the same as the rich, for instance, when you buy bread or rice. So that's inadequate to put consumption taxes. What we need to do is to increase progressive revenues like income and wealth taxation to individuals and also to corporations. For instance, the financial sector that very often does not pay taxes in countries. And we have very good examples. For instance, Brazil was charging a very small financial transaction tax, and actually that helped to finance the expansion of social protection. In Mongolia, a small tax on copper exports, on mineral copper exports, served to pay a universal child benefit. That means to all children of Mongolia, which was very useful for her families and for education. Second, we can fight illicit financial flows that are very large and they are illegal, like money laundering or like tax evasion. Third, we can restructure or reduce debt, and leading Napil and other colleagues are going to talk about that now, but more than 60 countries in the world have reduced debt in recent years, and it's really feasible. Fourth, important for households, we can increase social security coverage, formalizing workers in the informal economy with good contracts. And that is a way to actually extend social security, as Argentina, Brazil, Tunisia, or Uruguay have done. Then for low-income countries, we can ask for more aid and transfers. And then we can tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves like Chile and Norway have done. And what does this mean? It sounds kind of complicated, but it just means that central banks have a lot of reserves accumulated in the central bank. And this is a conservative policy. There's a kind of rule of thumb that says that it has to be at least 4 months of exports. But reality is that central banks have many more reserves accumulated there. And now I want you to think and put that in context, for instance, where there's a food security situation, as in many sub-Saharan Africa countries. Why countries do have to have all this money just accumulated in the central bank when people may be starving? This is, this is not right. So this is another source that we can tap also for education. Seventh, another option will be to adopt a more accommodative macroeconomic framework, as countries have been doing, having some tolerance to inflation or to fiscal deficit. And eighth, to reallocate public expenditure, focusing on replacing expenditure that have huge cost and very low social impact, for instance, defense or military. And we have countries that have done that, like Costa Rica or Thailand, that they cut defense and use these funds for expanding health. Now, what is very important to understand is that these different alternatives must be discussed openly in national dialogue. These decisions affect the lives of millions of people, so they cannot be technocratic decisions taken by a few technocrats behind closed doors in the Ministry of Finance. They must have open and inclusive social dialogue. Thank you. I think these are the main points.
Thanks to you, Isabel. Quite useful, really, to know that there are alternatives, that we are not condemned to austerity policies. And we should be able to discuss that openly with our society. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabel. Now, let's see, we have just a second, please. I have some troubles. We have, wait, please, please, please. Sorry. I'm having some troubles with my computer. Okay, again, we have the word now. We're going to give the floor to Juan Pablo Bohoflavsky, who will explore the links between public and private debt and the right to education, focusing on the pandemic's context. Juan Pablo is an international consultant on finance and human rights. He was the United Nations independent expert on debt and human rights during 2014 to 2020. He previously worked for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, defended the Argentine state in international litigations, and as a consultant for the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and also at the Office of High Commission on Human Rights. He holds a PhD in law, and he has published books and articles on economy and human rights. We are ready to listen to you, Juan Pablo. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Great. Many thanks, Madeleine, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. The two previous panelists focused on the implication of public debt, and in particular debt with international financial institutions for the right to education. And I would like to briefly focus on private debt and also its relation to public debt in the debate that we are proposing in the context of the right to education. Millions of households around the world make hard choices for the education of children and adolescents, often based on economic considerations and the total dependence on access to credit. And in certain cases, households, we know, must decide which member of the family is more deserving of education, which can at times, we know, mean only the eldest child or the boy rather than the girl. The call to prevent the risk of over-indebtedness reflects a mounting situation around the world and may often refer to debt for secondary education too. Student loans have also been on the rise as the public education system in many countries have faced austerity, private schools have expanded, and the cost of education has grown rapidly in real terms. So student loans for tertiary education are usually perceived as a positive investment and good debt, so-called, as they could go a long way towards better educational qualifications and employment opportunities, and may also provide some financial stability for the individual and the entire household. Evidence suggests, however, that college loans no longer guarantee social mobility and financial stability. So how do we connect education-related private debt and macroeconomy? There are two drivers of the increase in private indebtedness. First, the flourishing supply side of finance, which deregulation and increasing financialization being its facilitating instruments, which also includes the commodification and financialization of essential components to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, including prominently the right to education. The second driver is a reconfiguration of many human needs for social reproduction and that become actually unmet financial needs. So while the past century has witnessed the establishment and expansion of social safety nets, the gaps that remain provide fertile ground for private debt to flourish. Accounting for a significant portion of private debt in most countries, high individual and household debt has been associated with inequality, macroeconomic instability, unsustainable sovereign debt, and financial crisis. Low wages, poverty, and inequality exacerbated by such policies as privatization, austerity measures, labor market flexibilization, have pushed millions of people into private debt, which in turn has pushed millions of people into poverty and informality, making them more vulnerable to all kinds of abuse. So at the core of this phenomenon lies the so-called financial inclusion, that is, in other words, the colossal failure of states to ensure the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights for all. The explosive increase in private debt is what has sustained aggregate demand and economic growth over the past decades, often at the expense of indebted households. Millions of people around the world transfer a significant part of their wealth and well-being to the financial sector, whose links to the real economy continue to erode, compromising shared prosperity and financial stability and security, and reinforcing inequality. So if we contextualize these issues within the pandemic, we see from the one hand that it is more crucial than ever to suspend debt payments and services to the financial sector by low-income families and poor households to avoid emergency cash transfer from states that end up entering financial circuits rather than fueling the real economy and helping families. So adequate mechanisms should be put in place to guarantee that they will be able to navigate through this pandemic without being drained and literally destroyed. On the other hand, as Isabel explained already, the conditionalities already agreed by international financial institutions with borrowing countries, and also the ideological assumptions do not deviate from the economic orthodoxy that have characterized all IMF policies, even while acknowledging that social spending can be important in the short term to cope with the pandemic. So targets related to prioritizing medium and long-term fiscal objectives, increased commodification of public services, and deregulation conditions both present and future state choices. Actually, the IMF has also begun to approve new or adapt existing loans conditioned on fiscal consolidation. The loan programs with Egypt, Ukraine, Jordan, Pakistan, and Ecuador already include stringent fiscal commitment relating to primary surplus targets and also fiscal consolidation measures. Costa Rica, seeking IMF support, has proposed tax increases along with privatization, freezing public sector wages, and additional austerity measures. Argentina is also seeking a new arrangement with the IMF. Colombia's regressive tax reform that led to massive protests and brutal state repression 2 months ago can be tracked down to the agreement signed between the Colombian government and the IMF last year. So therefore, the right to education is under threat from a number of economic sources, threats that are being materialized through both private and public debt. Today, more than ever, undertaking human rights impact assessments of economic policies and economic reforms is more relevant than ever. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Pablo. Very, very interesting to hear about private debts again. And we all know that in our countries, many families have, poor families mainly, are in debt because they lack the resources for education and health, basically, as well as houses. We are learning a lot, I think, and what I appreciate the most is that they can give us, Juan Pablo as well as Isabel, examples of countries that are really fighting back this very, very unfair way of indebtedness in the countries, in our countries. It's our turn now to listen to Lydie B. Nakpil. Lydie is a coordinator of Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Vice President of the Freedom from Debt Coalition Philippines, and Chairperson of Oriana Women's Movement in Philippines. Irina co-founded regional and global networks such as Jubilee South Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. She has been working for more than 3 decades as an activist for economic, gender, and environmental justice in national and international campaigns. She will bring civil society perspective from the Global South on debt and its impact on a state's ability to fulfill the economic and social rights of its citizens, including the right to education. Lydie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you here in Manila. It's close to 10 o'clock at night, and so it's a good evening. You know, the total public external debt of developing countries amounted to more than $8 trillion at the start of the pandemic. Given the urgency of the debt problem, the huge nature of this debt problem, especially in the face of multiple crises, the international responses thus far have been spectacular failures in providing significant relief, and more so in pursuing the structural changes needed to address the problem at its roots and provide just and enduring solutions. The IMF and the G20 debt relief initiatives are nowhere near what is urgently needed and what justice requires, given the historical reasons for the accumulation of unsustainable and illegitimate debts. Too few countries are covered, and so-called middle-income countries are shut out, when in fact the majority of the world's poor are in middle-income countries. Multilateral debts are not included, and the participation of private lenders is voluntary and merely encouraged. Amounts are too little, and most are merely temporary suspension of payments. And the debt sustainability framework being used is too narrow and comes with deeply problematic assumptions and assertions and the non-recognition of the problem of illegitimate debt. Southern countries will be facing even greater debt burdens due to the huge increases in loans and other debt-creating flows as part of the fiscal responses to COVID. For instance, multilateral development banks increased their lending by up to 30% since the pandemic started. And most would view this as probably positive, but we are deeply concerned that there's even going to be greater debts in the face of the pandemic. Citizens' movements must push against false solutions, the inadequate relief, the austerity measures, which have been spoken about excellently by our other speakers, and more loans in response to the crisis. Instead, we must strongly campaign for the following. First, unconditional cancellation of public debt by all lenders for all countries in need. Second, use of resources freed from debt to boost healthcare, education, and other essential services and rights. Third, conducting of national debt audits by both governments and citizens in borrowing countries as well as in lending countries. Review and changes in lending, borrowing, and payment policies that should be international as well as national. There should be a fair, transparent, multilateral framework for debt crisis resolution under the auspices of the UN. There should be reparations for the damages caused by debt and conditionality such as austerity measures. And there should be progressive taxation and stopping illicit financial flows, which Isabel has already mentioned. But of course, the greatest challenge that we need to fight for is really the thoroughgoing and profound transformation of economic and financial systems. Thank you, and looking forward to having a discussion with all of you.
Thank you, Lydie, very much. The voice of the social citizens, the social organizations, very, very strong voice condemning the false solutions to our problems derived from the COVID pandemic. We will now hear our next panelist will be Christopher Yalukanda. Christopher here works as Director for Research at the Zambia National Union of Teachers. He holds a doctorate degree, a PhD in psychology, a master's degree in special education from the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. He has taught for 33 years at both primary and secondary school levels. He is currently a board member of Education International Research Institute and a member of the Research Advisory Board of Education International. He has served as chairperson of the first Teaching Council of Zambia. He is currently the coordinator of the Learning Through Play and Action Aid Teachers Union's education financing projects in Zambia. We're ready to listen to you. You have the floor, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Madrine. I don't know whether I've pronounced the name correctly.
Correctly.
Yeah, but I must begin my presentation by acknowledging that education plays a very critical role in our society, and I think without it, development cannot take place. However, as many people have observed, many governments, particularly developing countries, have not prioritized education on their development agenda. According to the Education Commission report, says that as many as 43 countries are spending less than 15% of their budget on education. So clearly we can see that there is no serious commitment towards education. Debt and austerity policy measures have been cited, particularly in most developing countries, as contributing to the decline in education financing. In this presentation, I'll focus on Zambia. I'll begin by giving maybe a background about Zambia. Then I discuss briefly the debt situation and its austerity measure policy in Zambia. I also discuss the impact of austerity measures on the delivery of quality education in Zambia. I conclude by discussing the strategies for mobilizing revenues from domestic resources to support the education sector. As you may be all aware, Zambia is a land-linked country which is located in sub-Saharan Africa, with a population of about 18.8 million. Economically, it heavily depends on copper mining and agriculture. An overview of the structure of the Zambian general education system shows that out of 10,167 schools, 90% or 9,000 are primary school and 10%, about 1,000, are secondary school. A total of about 4.2 million learners are enrolled in Zambian schools, representing a gross enrollment rate of 1.043 at primary and 46.4 at secondary school level. The efficiency and equity indicators suggest that the need for further strengthening of the general education system, especially the low quality indicators that show how completion rates, low pupil book ratio, teacher pupil ratio, very low contact hours, and poor learning outcomes, as shown in the national assessments, both the EGRA and the Examination Council. The current situation in Zambia is that the education budget has been declining since 2015. In 2015, it was 20.2, 2016, 17.2, 2017, 16.5, 2018, 15.3, and the latest is 2021 was 11.4 budget. This clearly falls short of both the regional and international recommendation thresholds. Yeah. The total of the budget expenditure, which is very low, is risking compromising the education sector in terms of access and quality. So this decline is being attributed mainly to over-reliance on borrowing by government. Our government has been borrowing, especially from both external and internal concession loans. Since 2015, the government of the Republic of Zambia has borrowed heavily to finance large-scale infrastructure projects, which has culminated into large fiscal deficit. Currently, the external debt is almost estimated at 20 billion US dollars, which is far too much. It's almost 80%, in terms of repayment, it's almost 80% of the GDP. In terms of domestic borrowing, the government owes also a lot of money to civil servants, including teachers, huge sums of money in unpaid arrears. So this rapid increase in public debt, which is currently, as I said, standing at about 80% of the national GDP from 35% at the end of 2014, puts Zambia at a high risk of debt distress. Already, Zambia has defaulted paying interest on the first Euro bonds, which were due in 2020. We were not able to pay the interest, and the government is also negotiating with the other lenders like the Chinese on how best they can reschedule or restructure the loans they pay to Zambia. This debt situation is also being worsened by the rising inflation rates in the country, also compounded by high exchange rates, depreciations, and an increase in food prices. So this means that the national LGBT growth has slowed down to an estimated 2%. In 20 Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
You can hear me. So currently the account deficit is expected to broaden due to the increase in public spending and also other factors. What is the impact of this debt and austerity measures on the education sector? In the education sector, there's been a negative impact in Zambia, especially towards the recruitment of teachers. We have a critical shortage of teachers, but in 2021, the government has only managed to recruit 1,200 teachers out of over 50,000 trained teachers who are roaming the streets. This is affecting the pupil-teacher ratio. These austerity measures have also affected the procurement of teaching and learning materials, leading to poor quality instructions in the classroom. This is clearly seen in the national assessment results, which are showing poor learning outcomes. Wage caps have been affected, like already my colleagues have indicated. Teachers form the largest part of the civil service, and the government, through these austerity measures, have imposed wage caps so that the salary increments are very minimal and not very meaningful to the teachers. Currently, the lowest paid teacher is getting about $200, and the graduate teacher about $300, which does not motivate the teachers to do their work properly because the salaries are too low. The way forward is that we need to mobilize these resources. We don't need to depend too much on foreign resources. So the first thing is for government to formulate laws and ways to minimize or completely curtail tax avoidance and close tax havens. There are companies which come here every after 5 years, they change their name just to avoid paying tax. And also government should broaden the tax base to raise more revenue, especially in the extractive industry, in the mining industry, where there is a lot of money, but we are not collecting the proper revenue from the mining or extractive industry. Government also needs to engage other stakeholders, like others have already indicated, to discuss domestic mobilization of funds. They should not just make decisions on their own. They should involve the unions, they should involve other stakeholders, they should involve investors in trying to find the best way of raising resources. If it means introducing an education tax, which will particularly support the education sector, it will be welcome. We also strongly feel that some of the areas where the monies are being allocated do not deserve it. So we look at military spending and police spending. This money can be rechanneled and spent towards the education sector. And more importantly, we need to negotiate for debt cancellation and restructuring for those we have. We know currently already government is engaging the IMF in order to find the best way of giving Zambia some support financially. But more importantly, also within the public service, there must be a lot of transparency and accountability in the uses of public resources. In conclusion, I would say that debt and austerity measures have really impacted negatively on the provision of quality education, particularly at early childhood education, because.
Christopher,
Hello?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are running out of time. Could you?
No, I'm in my
shorten?
conclusion. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just say domestic resources is key and very important because it's sustainable than depending on donor funding. Like IMF estimated that almost all developing countries have the potential to increase their tax revenues substantially. So I encourage domestic resource mobilization than depending on donor funding. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Christopher. Thank you. Sorry for the time. But it was interesting to listen to the Zambia concerned about that and how they are trying to find the solutions to it. Now we have the voice of a very important feminist perspective coming from Latin America, from Bolivia. We will listen to Mónica Novillo, who is a coordinator of the Network of Popular Education Among Women. It's REPEN in Spanish. And Mónica is a social communicator, and she has a very wide, extensive experience working with women's organizations in training programs on gender, leadership, citizenship, advocacy, women's human rights, and mainstreaming gender perspective in legislative proposals. We are ready to listen to you, dear Mónica. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Es un gusto estar en este espacio. Consideramos que esta es una gran oportunidad para incluir también la perspectiva de género en la reflexión sobre los impactos de la deuda y las políticas de austeridad que están en toda la región y en todo el mundo. Quiero empezar mencionando que para quienes trabajamos tratando de incluir la perspectiva de igualdad de género en las políticas públicas, ha sido fundamental el aprendizaje que nos han pasado los movimientos de mujeres y feministas de que los compromisos de los estados deben trascender los discursos y traducirse en acciones concretas que deben estar acompañadas de presupuestos justos y equitativos. La perspectiva de los presupuestos sensibles a género ha incluido al movimiento de mujeres y feministas justamente en el debate de las políticas fiscales. Son los presupuestos sensibles a género una herramienta fundamental que permiten verificar con información y evidencia el grado de compromiso con ciertas temáticas. Se trata entonces de un indicador de la voluntad política. Y mirar los presupuestos, no solamente con la perspectiva de género, podemos incluir algunas otras perspectivas, nos permitirá ver cómo las políticas priorizadas cuentan con presupuesto para su implementación. Es decir, donde los temas que son importantes tendrán una asignación presupuestaria alta y los otros temas que no son importantes tendrán siempre una asignación presupuestaria menor. Al mismo tiempo, los presupuestos sensibles a género son una estrategia para lograr avanzar hacia la igualdad de género. La igualdad de género que está además planteada en el marco de los compromisos de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Por eso los movimientos de mujeres y feministas han estado concentrando sus esfuerzos en lograr mayores presupuestos para avanzar en políticas orientadas a superar las desigualdades de género, enfocándose además en sectores con situaciones de mayor vulnerabilidad. Hablamos de las niñas, las adolescentes, las mujeres migrantes, las mujeres indígenas, las mujeres afrodescendientes en nuestra región, las mujeres con discapacidades o también las mujeres con diversidades sexuales. La historia nos demuestra que en periodos de crisis y de contracción económica son los sectores vinculados con las políticas de protección social, particularmente aquellos destinados a la niñez y a la igualdad de género, los que sufren los primeros cortes presupuestarios. Esto no solamente pasa en las políticas nacionales, sino también en las políticas subnacionales en los gobiernos locales. Entonces vemos cómo cada vez que existe una reducción de los ingresos para los gobiernos, donde cortan es en niñez y en políticas de igualdad. Un informe reciente de la CEPAL sobre la política fiscal en tiempos de pandemia o de COVID evidencia que nuestros estados en América Latina, justamente debido a la emergencia sanitaria por COVID-19, enfrentan un complejo contexto de mayor endeudamiento público, reducción de su recaudación tributaria, en muchos casos por evasión fiscal, y bajos precios de las materias primas de las que somos todavía dependientes, los famosos commodities. Y al mismo tiempo, el incremento de demanda de las políticas de protección social, entre ellas el tema de salud, que ha sido muy notorio en el periodo de la pandemia, y el tema de la educación, que se ha visto fuertemente confrontada y desafiada. En el mismo informe, la CEPAL recomienda para la región acelerar la transición hacia estados de bienestar social que garanticen mejores condiciones de vida para todos y provean de fundamentos sólidos para el desarrollo sostenible mediante la reducción de la desigualdad, el fortalecimiento de los sistemas de protección social, incluyendo la adopción de un ingreso básico universal y que proporcionen sistemas de educación y de salud de calidad y sistemas de pensiones también con calidad. Y nosotras agregaríamos con una clara inclusión de la perspectiva de igualdad de género porque las crisis económicas en general han mostrado que suelen tener un claro rostro femenino. Finalmente, cabe alertar sobre los efectos diferenciados por género de todas estas crisis si no se orienta un gasto público efectivo y equitativo para atender las necesidades de la sociedad. En el caso particular de la educación, la pandemia ha puesto en evidencia que esto, si no se atienden las necesidades de género, se tiende a profundizar las desigualdades, particularmente entre mujeres y hombres. De acuerdo a Oxfam, en Bolivia, en un reporte reciente, casi 1.5 millones de mujeres hoy forman parte de la población económicamente inactiva, es decir, el doble de los hombres, justamente por producto de lo que ha sido la pandemia. Y en muchos casos, esta población, estas mujeres, tendrán que enfrentar además la dedicación exclusiva al trabajo doméstico y de cuidado sin remuneración, lo que podría todavía traducirse en mayor empobrecimiento de muchos hogares en Bolivia. Muchas niñas podrían abandonar la escuela para dedicarse al trabajo de cuidado y facilitar la posibilidad de incluirse en otras actividades productivas a las madres en la familia, y esto ante el cierre, por ejemplo, de los centros de cuidado infantil. Es urgente entonces, desde nuestra perspectiva, considerar la sostenibilidad de la vida en el centro de las propuestas de desarrollo e impulsar la inclusión de los presupuestos sensibles a género en el diseño de las políticas de recuperación económica de la crisis de la pandemia y en los compromisos de la agenda de desarrollo, no olvidando dar respuesta a las necesidades sociales, pero sobre todo evitar los retrocesos en los ámbitos en los que se había alcanzado progresos, particularmente el tema de la igualdad de género. Muchas gracias, Madeleine.
Thanks to you, Monica. Very, very important to listen to the women, because it is true. Women are, and children mainly, are deeply affected by the pandemic. We will go a little bit further on the final comments. We will stress a little bit more on this issue. Now we have the time to listen to the research evidences that will be presented by Tato Kundadze. He is a researcher responsible for the Georgia case study in the framework of a new research initiative led by the Global Campaign for Education, Open Society Foundations, and Action Aid on debt relief and education financing. He had a challenge of summarizing the results of this long-time research in just 5 minutes. Let's hear his key conclusions. We are ready to listen to you, Tato. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madeleine, for giving me this opportunity. And I will present presentation. We'll use PowerPoint presentation for sharing the findings of this research paper. So let me start with the objective of our research. The key objective was to find out if there is any linkage, if there is any association between current spending on education, current financing in education, and public debt, external public debt. This was the main goal. But before going there, before going into the details, I want to say a few words about the current context. Like many other countries, Georgia was also hit hard by COVID-19. Our external sector was completely collapsed. Georgia is a tourism-dependent country, and our revenues from tourists collapsed and there was a huge decrease in foreign direct investments, and also export fell immensely. And there was a risk of getting a risk of currency problem, because Georgia is also import-dependent country, and it needed hard currency to import goods and services. As a result of it, Georgia public debt increased. Georgian public debt increased around by 20%, and also external public debt to GDP ratio increased from 33%, around 33%, up to 50%. And before going to key findings, I also want to show you what kind of pattern we have in terms of government financing of education. Georgia strives to be a member of European Union, but unfortunately, Georgia spends much less in education than European countries on average. It spends around 3% on education as a share of GDP, and it is much less than for the countries of former Soviet unions, like Lithuania, Estonia, or Latvia. And a good illustration of this policy is a PISA ranking. This is an international ranking which shows that Georgia is falling back and lagging back, and it's almost in the range among these countries. And it's like falling back in terms of scientific literacy, in terms of reading literacy, and mathematical literacy. And key reason for this, and also a good illustration, is that in Georgia, profession of teacher is a least paid job, and it's also proved by OECD research paper, which also mentions that in the sample of the countries of the research, that Georgia is paying the least to its teachers. So I should also mention that Georgia is a fiscally conservative country. Georgia doesn't have so much debt, because we even have a special policy, special fiscal rule, which says that Georgia shouldn't borrow more than 60% of its GDP. However, as a result of COVID-19, Georgia was forced to breach this law. And what was a political implication in terms of government spending on education? In 2019, Georgian government made a pledge that it will increase government spending on education up to 6% by 2022. But as a result of COVID-19 and as a result of increasing debt, as our Prime Minister mentioned, and also other fiscal problems, Georgia will no longer be able to increase its government spending, public spending on education up to 6% of GDP. And we wanted to see if there is a statistically significant long-term and short-term relationship between external debt and government spending on education. We built an econometric model to show this, and we find out that there is indeed this sort of relationship, negative relationship. For instance, 1% increase in public external debt to export ratio is associated with 0.05% decrease in government spending on education. And same applies to external debt service. 1% increase in public external debt service to government revenue is also associated with 0.26% decrease in government spending on education. So what are the final remarks? We are expecting that there will be a fourth wave of COVID-19, because there is, in many other countries, in many other developing countries, there is a low rate of vaccination, And we also expect that there will be a currency shock. And we also expect there will be further cuts. I should also mention that Georgia is not part of that suspension initiative because Georgian debt is not considered by international financial organization as risky. But key implication for Georgia and also for other countries is that even for the country like for the conservative country like fiscally conservative country like Georgia, a rise in external debt may have may create a serious risks and serious problems for in terms of education financing. And if we extrapolate these results for other lower income countries, then we can see that they could have much more. It could be much more problematic because they have much higher debts. And the final thing which I wanted to say, if it is a kind of a trade-off, if there is a trade-off between paying external debts and getting external debts, public external debts, and government spending on education, if it is a trade-off. And I don't think it's a trade-off, it's a self-imposed policy to some degree, because I can give an example. Georgia could, for instance, introduce progressive taxation, but we don't have progressive taxation, we have flat taxation. It's a teacher, a least paid job, teacher, the profession for the teachers, the progressive taxation is 20%. It's the same applies. The taxation is income tax is 20%, and the same applies to billionaires and millionaires. So I would say that this is not a trade-off, but it's a imposed policy. Thank you very much, and I will welcome your comments and questions.
Madeleine?
Sorry, I'm back. I had some troubles with my microphone. I was thanking Tato for the research and the very interesting conclusions, and I'm welcoming now Irina Kandadze. She has been involved in civil society development programs in Georgia since 1998. She is our colleague from the GCE Coalition in Georgia and executive director of the Center for Training and Consultancy. What else can we say about Georgie, Irina? I mean, CTC is one of the leading resource centers in Georgia, providing capacity building activities for civil society actors. In 2013, she was one of the founders of Georgian Coalition for Education, which currently unites 15 Georgian civil society organizations and advocates policies to enhance equal access to quality general education, as well as increased financing for education sector in Georgia. You have the floor, Irina.
Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you for this opportunity. I want to say a big thank you on the behalf of Georgian Coalition of Education for having the opportunity to conduct the research which Dato Tato just tried to present in a nutshell. Indeed, the research paper is very interesting and is already fully administered and available on our webpage and can be retrieved upon interest. Actually, as Tato has already mentioned, one of the key findings of the research is that there is really a negative relationship between external debt and public spending on education, on example of Georgia. And I think that the fact that even the country which is not considered as heavily indebted country that has the problem of education financing in terms of its public external debt indicates that shows a good insight and input for international campaign on debt relief for indebted countries. And we hope that this case study can be a valuable input for GCE in its global campaign. We, as a Georgian Coalition for Education, have already started our communication campaign based on the results of this particular research to alert on the potential decrease of financing for education. As Tato has already mentioned, there has already been announced that in coming years we might not hope for substantial increase of education financing, and in that context, of course, for us this is a big worry, how to ensure that no decrease is administered, but also to ensure that the way forward to increasing education financing is back on the track. So I think that will be definitely one of our big challenges, and we believe that this paper and the findings of this research will be for us very helpful in this communication campaign with decision makers and with relevant stakeholders and public, especially in the context that just recently we have finalized another research which try to assess the education loss of our school students due to COVID crisis, and the research findings show that there is really quite a severe educational loss, and in that context, definitely education financing matters a lot. I do hope that the case study will play its role and be used as an insight for global campaign for education, as far as we believe that countries like Georgia can only have exercise some measures oriented on debt relief through global campaign. As far as in this context, there is no eligibility of countries like Georgia for any debt relief measures, and there is a very low probability that Georgian government may engage in a similar dialogue with creditors. So we do hope that in this kind of issues, the global civil society campaign will have a very important say, and we are ready to be part of this campaign as much as we can further contribute to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. You have added to what Christopher told us, and we learned about Georgia and the ways they are dealing with this debt issues and the damage on education again. We have come to an end with the intervention of our panelists. We thank them very, very deeply. And we are about to start the question and answer session. We will have two videos. We will see them one after the other, and we will ask who of you will be ready to answer to the question that are raised by youth representatives in two regions of our world, the Asian region and the Latin American region. I think we are ready to see the first their recorded videos. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm playing first one of the videos, and then maybe one of you can step up to answer, and then play the other. Okay. So.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jericho Darakan from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines and a member of Youth for Nationalism and Democracy, a member organization of Education Network Philippines. The COVID-19 pandemic has only worsened and exposed the long-standing problems in the Philippine education system. We continue to suffer from lack of resources and other necessary infrastructures, such as computer and internet access, which make distance learning difficult for Filipino students, especially the poor. Now, how can we ensure that the budget freed up from debt servicing will be used towards developing and establishing an education system that is accessible and responsive to the needs of the Filipino students?
Thank you, Jericho. Now, I would like to invite any of the panelists that would like to answer to Jericho's question. That actually is a question that can be raised by any other student in the third world, especially. Isabel, Juan Pablo, who would like to answer to Jericho? Who are the two participants? Raise their hands. I can't see the hand. Let's see. Okay, I give the floor to Isabel Ortiz. Thank you, Isabel.
No, thanks to you and to everybody. I think virtually the question is what to do, and which is, of course, a very legitimate question. Well, the first thing, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Yes.
So critically, the first thing to do is to check the situation with your government. Is your government cutting expenditures? Is investing sufficiently in education or not? And once you have, and there are a number of sources that you can check that. You can check our global austerity alert. You can check IMF papers, World Bank papers, government papers. That will be the best. And they are generally, this is public information and it's available online. So if you find that this is not sufficient to secure adequate quality universal education at all levels, then what you need to do is to claim it, to state it. So we want universal quality education and et cetera, social protection services and benefits to support the students, etc. And once you do that, you do need to really call for national dialogue. And this is what we were mentioning before. These decisions cannot be taken by a few technocrats in the Ministry of Finance behind closed doors. They're too important. They impact the lives of millions of people. So they must be discussed in national, public, social dialogue. And that means dialogue with all important stakeholders that will include, of course, the government, trade unions, employers, civil society organizations, like yourselves, like teacher organizations, etc. And of course, you need to involve the Ministry of Finance because ultimately they might take these decisions. And you need to involve parliamentarians and people that have been, importantly working on the national development strategy. once you call for this national dialogue, it is very important to have some type of assessment of what is going on and the impacts of possible austerity cuts or others. And for instance, Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky mentioned the human rights assessments. This will be a very important instrument. There are others too, but you need to show what are the positive or negative social impacts of different proposed policies, and then what are the alternatives. So this is set in the national dialogue. Otherwise, the national dialogue will go, through other ways you don't want. And then you try, once the national dialogue runs, then you try to, and it's convened, and this needs to be done timely and rapidly, particularly at the time that the budget is discussed. So then you try to agree publicly and openly on alternatives that are positive for education and generally for people in accordance to advance human rights. So I think that is the way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. I'm sure that Jericho will be very happy with your very detailed answer. Thank you once again. We are ready to hear a second video.
Sorry, Madeleine, I thought Lydie wanted to answer that question too.
Wait a minute.
Sorry, I'm not sure. Yeah, if Lydie wanted to answer that Jericho's question too.
Yeah, just a little bit, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Thank you. So Jericho and I come from the same country. And I just want to say first, I agree with what Isabel has said. We really need to prepare our arguments well and do the research and so on. But also being familiar with the political situation in the Philippines, what we also need to do is to campaign very hard to have citizens' pressure on our government, particularly, for instance, the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, who does the budget decisions of the country, and then also the president, because he has the power to veto the budget decisions. So here in the Philippines, it really takes a lot of citizens' pressure for this kind of thing to make possible this kind of thing. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's really a lot of hard campaigning. That's all to add. Thank you.
Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you, Lydie. Now we're ready to see the second video, please.
Yes, so let's see if I can. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Thank you.
De jóvenes de la campaña latinoamericana por el derecho a la educación. En las últimas décadas de políticas neoliberales, se ha hecho de México uno de los países más desiguales de América Latina. Según la Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe, CEPAL, 2/3 partes de la riqueza están en manos del 10% más rico del país, y el 1% de los muy ricos acaparan más de 1/3. Históricamente, hemos sufrido ataques masivos de reformas de austeridad, como de la privatización de la educación, con tendencia burocrática a favor del capitalismo. Ejemplo de ello es la reciente reducción del presupuesto económico designado a nuestras escuelas normales y a instituciones autónomas, desde las organizaciones de normales oficiales del estado de Michoacán. Nos hemos dado a la tarea de organizar protestas masivas para exigir el acceso de todos y todas a una educación gratuita, pública y de calidad. Hemos logrado hacer oír nuestras demandas, pero no lo suficiente. Así que mi pregunta es, ¿cómo podemos lograr que los impactos negativos de estas políticas de austeridad sean un elemento importante del debate de los líderes mundiales? ¿Y qué podemos hacer para lograr que la Global Partnership for Education se involucre en un debate estratégico con la sociedad civil y especialmente con los y las activistas jóvenes sobre este tema.
Okay. Thank you. I think that the first question has already been answered in a way by Isabel. Who would like to take the floor and answer to the second question raised by the Mexican student? Are there any hands up? Let's see. A ver. Juan Pablo, please.
Yes,
I can
thank
give
you. Madel, I would prefer to answer in Spanish to our colleague from Mexico, if possible. So I give interpreters a few seconds so they can get ready. Gracias por la pregunta. Es un punto, me parece que hay un micrófono abierto por ahí. Es un punto muy importante el que hace el colega de México, y creo que en este punto es crucial vincular las políticas fiscales con, en general, los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, y en particular el derecho a la educación, porque es un derecho altamente sensible frente a la existencia o carencia de recursos estatales. Entonces quisiera insistir nuevamente con un instrumento que en realidad constituye una obligación internacional en el campo de los derechos humanos, que es la realización de evaluaciones de impacto sobre los derechos humanos de las reformas económicas y las políticas económicas. Y esto incluye, por supuesto, y de manera prominente, las políticas fiscales. En definitiva, se trata de, al final del día, del derecho a la verdad, es decir, ofrecer a la ciudadanía una explicación cabal, detallada, y también con fundamento científico de las conexiones intrínsecas, profundas, que existen entre las políticas fiscales de los países y los derechos humanos en general, y el derecho a la educación. Entonces, al momento de plantear discusiones en el Congreso, por ejemplo, acerca del presupuesto para el siguiente año, contar con este análisis de impacto anticipado sobre los derechos humanos con seguridad va a enriquecer y al mismo tiempo limitar las opciones de los gobiernos, ¿no? Isabel ofreció un listado abierto de opciones que en definitiva son menos lesivas, opciones de políticas económicas que son menos lesivas para los derechos humanos. Bueno, tiene que haber una justificación acerca de por qué se recorre primero caminos de economía ortodoxa que ya han demostrado que llevan muchas veces al colapso de los derechos humanos.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Somebody else would like to answer to? Nobody else? But the two answers have been very, very good, I think. And because of time, I think we are going to go my final comments, and I will do them in Spanish. Muy bien. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer muy profundamente a cada uno de los panelistas, así como a los participantes que nos han acompañado en esta importantísima sesión. La deuda, los impactos negativos de la deuda y la austeridad que nos vienen de políticas económicas internacionales, creo que ha sido bastante bien presentada por todos los panelistas y traer también a la conciencia de la juventud, como las dos últimas intervenciones que hemos tenido, sobre lo que es posible hacer para no sentirnos, como dije hace un momento, creo, condenados a vivir bajo esta carga tan terrible de las deudas para ejercer derechos humanos. Especialmente en el contexto de la pandemia, han sido los derechos de salud y educación los que han sido más afectados. Y como bien se ha dicho, la solución falsa de los préstamos y el endeudamiento tiene que ser traído a debate nacional. Pero para ello es muy importante la investigación que nos permite presentar evidencia, que permite que nuestras demandas tengan una fundamentación muy clara, como acaba de decir Juan Pablo, que sean científicas, que no haya lugar a dudar de ellas. Solo así podemos convencernos y convencer a los estados que ellos son los garantes del derecho. Y si bien es cierto que podemos admitir la intervención del sector privado, pero con no intenciones de gran lucro, como también lo señaló Juan Pablo, ¿verdad? El último, mejor dicho, el más importante garante de los derechos es el Estado. La recomendación que se acaba de dar de estar al día en los procesos de definición de los presupuestos públicos en nuestros países, creo que es crucial. Tenemos que tener, y de ahí el valor de la investigación, y estoy muy contenta y orgullosa de que la campaña mundial por la educación, en alianza con la Open Society Foundation y Action Aid, hayamos iniciado más investigación en casos concretos como el de Georgia que hemos escuchado esta mañana, para poder tener mayor base para nuestras demandas. Y como también se ha dicho, las demandas nacen y tienen muchísima importancia a nivel nacional. El trabajo con el Congreso, los parlamentarios, es importante, pero tenemos que informarnos, como dije hace un momento, de cuál es el proceso, cuándo comienza el proceso que finalmente llevará a la definición del presupuesto para los próximos años. A veces son presupuestos anuales, a veces quinquenales, ¿verdad? Pero en este momento nos interesa llamar la atención de la importancia que puede tener nuestra voz en el contexto actual de la cumbre mundial sobre educación que lleva a cabo la Alianza Mundial por la Educación. Se discute allí exactamente esto: cómo financiar el derecho a la educación, porque de eso se trata. Y estamos hablando, como dijo Rifat en un inicio, no solamente de niños y niñas, estamos hablando de billones de personas, de familias que han sido afectadas y continúan siendo afectadas por la pandemia, porque todos sabemos que desafortunadamente la pandemia no ha concluido. Aquí en el Perú estamos bajo la amenaza de una tercera ola, pero me he sorprendido cuando he escuchado que hay otras latitudes donde ya hay una cuarta ola de pandemia. Por lo tanto, tenemos que estar alertas a toda posibilidad o tal vez ya de facto recorte de los presupuestos para ejercer derechos, especialmente el derecho a la educación. Espero esta sesión ha sido grabada porque es muy necesario que estudiemos las alternativas que con tanta inteligencia nos presentó Isabel Ortiz. Hay 7, 8 alternativas que nos pueden llevar a contar con un presupuesto que se acerque a lo suficiente y adecuado para ejercer el derecho a la educación y otros derechos sociales como el de la salud y la vivienda y el trabajo decente también en este terrible contexto de pandemia. Hemos escuchado, creo que de tanto los expertos internacionales como los que trabajan como activistas en sus países, como Bolivia, Filipinas, México, y creo que debemos valorar que se nos han presentado evidencias de estudios que se han hecho en países en concreto. Es necesario, entonces, entrar nosotros a estudiar, a buscar la información precisa de las fuentes válidas para, repito, argumentar nuestra defensa de un presupuesto suficiente y adecuado para ejercer el derecho a la educación de todas y todas, tratando de ser fieles y coherentes con lo que dice la narrativa del Objetivo de Desarrollo número 4, ¿verdad? El derecho a una educación inclusiva, que nadie quede atrás, equitativa, dar más a quien más lo necesite, de calidad, eso quiere decir con pertinencia a la gran diversidad de nuestro mundo, y por último, que sea ese derecho ejercido a lo largo de la vida. Esto es, todo ser humano, desde el nacimiento hasta que decida seguir, tiene el derecho a la oportunidad de aprender y así desarrollarse como persona y especialmente desarrollarnos como sociedades y avanzar, no a paso lento, pero avanzar lo más rápidamente posible hacia una sociedad más justa, más equitativa y sobre todo donde cultivemos la armonía, el diálogo entre nosotros y nos libremos de conflictos terribles y guerras. Mi voto por la paz y mi voto por la voz de todos nosotros que estamos sufriendo la pandemia, pero que podemos juntos alzar la voz para que nos defendamos de ella y así en adelante construir un mundo mejor. Muchísimas gracias nuevamente a los panelistas, a los participantes, y esperamos, ¿no?, que ser escuchados en esta gran cumbre mundial de la Alianza Mundial por la Educación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madeleine, and thank you, everyone. We are running out of time, but I would like to thank the panelists and everyone for joining, and also Madeleine for chairing. If any of the attendees have further questions, I've left my email in the chat. It's christinacampaignforeducation.org. So that you can raise any questions you still have and you can send them to me. Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, let's defend together the right to education. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madeleine. Well done.
Are we leaving?
Gracias, Madeleine.
This is Rifat.
Gracias, Mónica. Muy bien. El tiempo es siempre un gran enemigo.
No te preocupes, siempre es así. Pero salió muy bien, gracias.
Muy bien, muy bien.
Gracias.
Mira, lo importante, gracias, contar con la grabación. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, gracias. Hasta mañana, Madeleine.
Hasta mañana también. Gracias a los intérpretes. Thank you to all the interpreters. Very good work, really. Very good. Thank you.